Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to shake things up and do things a little differently, and we're going to recover the topic of preparing the engine case for the install of the crankshaft, and actually install the crankshaft and get the case back together. The previous video, believe it or not, stirred some controversy. There was some disagreement on what parts of the case get lubed and which ones don't. And also what the pins are on the crank. Are they locating pins? Are they counter rotation pins? And so I'm going to straighten that all out. So, however, before we jump in, I just want to reiterate where we've been with this particular snowmobile. So we bought it 2 seasons ago on Facebook Marketplace for a very small amount of money. And had we not bought it, it probably would have gone into the junk pile. But we cleaned the carburetors, put some fuel in it, got it running, it sounded great, and we took it on a trip, and about 3 miles in, the engine lost compression and stopped running. And the reason why we determined was we had a cracked carburetor boot, which messed up one of the pistons. So we brought the snowmobile home, tore the top end apart, got all the parts together in preparation for a rebuild, and then it read that these machines were notorious for having leaky crank seals. So I wanted to have that looked at or fix that issue before we put the engine back together so we didn't have to deal with it again. So I didn't have the confidence at that time to take the job on myself. So I took the bottom half of the engine to our local Polaris dealer and paid the service department $120 an hour to replace the crank seals. Went a couple days later to pick up the crankshaft, the lower half of the engine, and was told that the work went well. However, that our crank was quote unquote a little noisy, but that we could expect some decent life out of it. This is the moment that motivated me to learn how to do this work myself. I mean, it says right on the invoice that the crank bearings were noisy and that the crankshaft's life might not be too long. If that were the case, then why go through with installing the crank seals and charging me for that work? So I wish they would have told me at that point it had made sense to replace the crankshaft. But anyway, got it back, did the top end rebuild, put the snowmobile back together, took it out on the second trip, and in the middle of nowhere at a really inopportune time, when I was out by myself, the engine seized again. Dragged it back on the trailer eventually, got it home, took it apart, and that was really the start of this series where we went through the journey of disassembling that motor to figure out what went wrong and put it back together. But I should mention, before we took on the work, we bought Polaris manuals. We talked to parts suppliers. We talked to other people that have machines like this. We searched the web. And we also watched YouTube videos like you're doing to get the confidence to take on the full job ourselves. So what this series is about is us consolidating all the information we learned for you. So your journey's faster, and hopefully we give you the confidence to take on projects like this yourself. Learning how to do work like this yourself will also save you money. Relying on the dealer cost us 2 sets of pistons, 2 sets of needle bearings, an engine boring, engine honing, 2 gasket sets, tools, and much more. So our aim is to be self-sufficient and to help you get there too. So I should mention, despite all the controversy, the machine runs great. As always, if you're enjoying our content, please subscribe to the channel, and we'd love to see any comments or feedback that you have for us. So here we go with part 3, take 2, installing the crankshaft in our case in preparation for the remainder of the rebuild. On the left is my original crank here, and on the right is my new crank. This bearing seized and prevented the crankshaft from turning. So this is the infamous PTO bearing that typically fails. Notice, can you hear that noise in the bearing? That means they're worn. And this one ultimately failed. So if you look at the new crankshaft, these bearings are silent. One of the things that I didn't realize, and I learned along the way, is these cranks came with 2 different types of bearings on the mag side end.
So if you aren't aware of that, you know, what I ultimately ended up doing was ordering the wrong one. So they have one that's about a 1/2 inch wide, which was for, I believe, the earlier models. And this one, my case takes a bearing that's 1 inch wide. So after I got my used crankshaft in and got ready to assemble my case for the first time, realized I had the wrong bearing, things didn't line up. So then I had to have another bearing shipped to me. I had to go to the dealer to use their puller and hydraulic press to get the old bearing off, and then wound up putting my crankshaft in the freezer and my new bearing in the oven for about 1/2 an hour on each, and basically put it all together. So that cost me about a day. It cost me a new bearing and $81 at the dealer to have the puller pulled off, because I didn't have a puller that could get behind this bearing and pull it off. So that's something to bear in mind. So with that, what I'm going to do now is get the case in here. Let's get ready to get this thing assembled. Okay, to do the crank assembly, we're going to do a couple things. So the first thing I'm going to do is put a little oil inside these bearings, just to make sure when it first starts, there's some lubrication in the bearings. I've heard people use 2-stroke oil. I've heard people use gear oil. I'm going to use some assembly lube. So hopefully that does the trick. But the purpose is just to make sure that when we first start the machine, as we're working to get it started, there is some lubrication on the bearings.
The next step is to install the crankshaft seals. And this is where I've gotten some comments on the original video. So I went back and checked the Polaris manual, and their instruction is to take Polaris low temperature grease and pack the inside of those oil seals with grease like I'm doing there, and then slide them onto the crankshaft. This is an area of the original video where we received a lot of comments. So what I'm doing here is I prepared the case for the install of the crankshaft. I've cleaned everything down with acetone and removed any previous gasket material. Now I'm applying grease to the labyrinth seals, and those grooves make up the labyrinth seals. And there's been a lot of commentary about whether or not that was a good idea to put any lube in that case, and that is exactly what the Polaris manual tells you to do. So that's what I've done here. Now we're going to install the crankshaft into the case.
And as we're working with the crankshaft, you'll notice that on each of the bearings there's a pin. And so what you want to do is get these pins all oriented up before you drop it in the case. Like that. So I'm going to go ahead and set this in the case. Working to make sure we got everything aligned. And now in the top of this case, if you can see, there's a recess for these pins. So what you can do is you want to spin the bearings down to make sure that all the pins go into the recesses in the case. And some of them you might need to lift the case slightly to move, like this one. So I'm going to do with this one. Wouldn't be fun if it didn't fight you a little bit with it. Okay, I'm going to just rotate this up a little bit. I've got this on some 4x4s, as you can see, to give room for the connecting rods too. So now with all those in their recesses, there's also a groove on the oil seals, and there's a corresponding, I should say a protrusion on the oil seals, and they need to go into the grooves also in the case. So it looks like I've got that all together correctly and all sealed. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to clean the edges of the case and get it ready to get it, put the gasket sealer on it and get it assembled.
For demonstration purposes, I pulled the crankshaft back out of the case. And what I'm doing here now is I'm putting down a bead of 1184 gasket sealer, a very thin bead, around the entire edge of the upper case.
I'm going to try to go very light, I guess I should say. I've seen videos where people do the other half of the case. And I've seen it where they do, in the manual, the Polaris manual says to do this bottom half of the case, or the top half of the case. So the risk you run doing it this way is getting squeeze out on your crank parts, getting it all over yourself when you assemble. But, you know, I like to try to default to the manual whenever I can. Now, whether or not that's material or not, we'll find out. So I think there's not a lot of contrast here. Hopefully you can see this, but I'm putting it ever so slight. If you go and buy your own tube of this stuff, I took a pretty big, I cut a pretty big, I made the opening pretty big on the top of this tube, but I would definitely go smaller if I were to do it again. So I'm just going around all the bolts, all the holes, all the surfaces here. I hope I do not have to take this apart again. Okay, so there we have it. Now I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little welding brush around here and just spread this thin.
Now I'm going to put the crankshaft back in the top half of the case, and we're ready for the next step.
Okay, just double checking to make sure we're all sealed up here, which we are. Now here comes the top half of the case. And voila. So now we're going to go ahead and insert our 8mm bolts. So when I took mine apart, I've seen other people do this, just lay them out. They're smarter than I am. I did take my bolts. There's a special order in which they go in. And I'll put a picture of the manual to show you that order. And so these bolts, there's multiple different sizes. So we're just gonna put these in finger tight to start. 1, 2. So it's basically in a crosshatch pattern. Okay. Okay, these are all together. So they take a 12mm socket, and I guess I'm going to do the same order again and just get them down finger tight. And then once we do this, to get these together, we're going to torque them in. We'll torque them to 10 pounds first, and then we'll torque them to the final pounds. We'll do it in 2 steps. Okay, I've got the case back together. I've got the bolts torqued. And so now I'm just checking it over to make sure, first of all, that the seals are all sealed, which they are. I've got bleed out all around the edges of the gasket material, which is in the process of drying. I'm going to see if my crank turns freely, which it does. My oil pump is turning. Gears turning. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to coat all these pins in bearings with oil. So each of these pins has some oil grooves in them. And then also in the top of these holes here, oil delivery holes. So I'm going to put some oil in each of these well to make sure the bearings get somewhere on there.
Rebuilding this engine twice and not wanting to go through the time and expense of doing it again, I may have been a little heavy-handed with the oil. So I'd recommend using your own judgment there.
We're ready for the next step.